I'm Madeline Greenburg, and this is Hello Precarity COVID FML edition. I want to thank the Brown Arts Initiative and Sydney Skybetter for making this opportunity possible. I am so excited to have with me Chaz Evans, a professor at the Northwestern School of Communication, a media artist working on incredible digital and installation projects and performances, including a recent 2019 project titled Frame Switch. So Chaz, thank you so much for taking the time to be here virtually with me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for talking to me, Madeline.
Absolutely. So I would love, I gave a little bit of a summary there of who you kind of are, but why don't you go ahead and say who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Chaz Evans, and I have a few roles. I am the director of exhibitions for VGA Gallery, which stands for Video Game Art Gallery, and is a not-for-profit arts organization that supports artists who make video games, any kind of artist that incorporates video games into their practice. And that's, sort of a community-driven effort that is based in Chicago, but has collaborators and friends all over the world. And we try to be pretty non-dogmatic and support interesting, experimental, or risky work at different levels of production. So it's from like just very small art games, like solo practitioners, to small indie studios, to sometimes noteworthy or sort of culturally important, even like the large budget games. So outside of my role at VGA, I am a lecturer at Northwestern University, where I teach a variety of new media art classes. And sometimes I just describe this as computer art classes, because more and more I have conversations where I realize that the term new media art doesn't mean a lot to certain people I'm talking to. So yeah, it's just a variety of ways to make creative media and artwork with your computer, which, so these classes include stuff like a introductory video game production studio, a creative web coding course called Web Convergence. I teach a performance art with screens class called Media Enabled Performance. A seminar on video game history, theory, and criticism, and 3D modeling and animation, and a course in the documentary MFA program, which is sort of an overlap between documentary practices and new media, called just interactive techniques. So yeah, that all fills out what is called the Media Arts and Game Design module in the Department of Radio, TV, Film at Northwestern in Evanston. So when I'm not working, or when I'm curating exhibitions or organizing programs for VGA, I am not teaching, then I also write about video games and related new media arts. And when I'm not doing all three of those things, sometimes I have time to make my own artworks as well. So I also try to be an artist doing individual projects in the cracks of all those other pursuits.
It's an incredible list of subjects and super cool things. I do want to point out a couple of other amazing projects that I have sort of stalked you through, including the Oiko board project is so much fun, and Unending Credits, which is just hilarious.
Yeah.
And so it seems like all of these projects, and I'd love to talk to you more as well about there we are, we keep freezing. But I'd love to talk to you more about your video game background as well, because I will be the first one to say I cannot play them for my life,
Sure.
But I love to watch them.
Yeah.
So big fan there. But your work seems to often question the agency of the user, and seems to disrupt normal objects and scenes to point out, as I said, some sort of comedy, this surrealism almost in reality. So we're talking about COVID-19, we're talking about the ways that the world has kind of come to a halt. Is there something in this time right now, the relative level of absurdity, that you're finding really motivating, or that you're finding really special?
Yeah, I think that is right. I think I am preoccupied, when it comes to interactive art, I am preoccupied with the kind of empty promises that a lot of sort of tech utopian thought have made as far as software and devices, as far as like how much people are empowered, or how much this is going to improve their lives. And really, a lot of software-based experiences are highly authored, I mean, and although they provide clarity towards a new experience that is at the cost of a very constrained experience. So I mean, of course, that's like really great, and also just like very sort of trapped at the same time. So bringing that up, that kind of paradox, and is something I am pretty interested in, and also something I always want to convey when I'm teaching new media or trying to support other artists, is to make sure that we call it like it is when people are making an interactive artwork, and saying like, really this is for the most part a bunch of your ideas that you are still expressing the way we would have dealt with in any other kind of discipline or art medium. And I guess the fact that you have to reveal that after people feel like maybe they've gotten a whole new lease on life is kind of a prank. You know, there's like a comedy to it, like you're pulling the rug out of someone, from under someone, perhaps. So I think you're absolutely right that is an interest that flows through a lot of my projects. How I see a similar theme that has arrived, just in the last 2 months of COVID-related lockdown and quarantine. I have seen a kind of brave new media ecosystem where all disciplines and all sort of cultural contexts that I've been familiar with and have interacted with are now flattened out into the same space, which is the one we're talking through right now, right? Which
interesting.
Is online streaming media. And what's very interesting is that video games and that kind of culture, especially when it's not in a contemporary art context, but in a very popular culture context, is very native to this particular media format. So much so that we have a multi-billion-dollar industry of streaming this kind of thing as like video game meta media through like platforms like Twitch, right? So I don't know how long a story I'm allowed to tell, but is it hard? Are you ready for like a sort of a long walk of a story? I don't know how long.
Please, honestly, I just want to hear any story. So great. They're going to kind of go through it, but anything you want to tell me, I'd love to hear.
Well, I kind of had this crazy experience last weekend where there was VGA Gallery was supposed to be a part of an exhibition at what was called the Hyde Park Art Center in Chicago, where they were doing a compilation exhibition of a bunch of different Chicago-based artist-run organizations all inside their large space, which of course got canceled, and then, or indefinitely postponed or whatever. And then some of the organizers related to that, which were part of another organization called the Public Media Institute, were putting on a conference in Houston that also got canceled, so that they were going to try to do this like online version of that conference that incorporated the participants of exhibition number 1 that I just mentioned. So it was, and these are all, as far as all the participants of this like show that was canceled, they're trying to recuperate with some kind of online participation. Like VGA is the only sort of interactive art, media art focused one. And the way they were going to sort of bring us all together was going to be a sort of online talk show. This is sort of like, a substitution for doing the show and this conference. So like another artist and curator who is brilliant, named Brandon Alvendia, and he's an incredible organizer in Chicago, said, Chaz, you should be on this talk show that we're sort of doing in place of all these other events. Which then, so I was on this giant Zoom call, which is effectively an internet talk show with about like what felt like 6 to a dozen other space organizers from the Chicago area and beyond, and it was all streamed live on Twitch, right? So this was very interesting because Twitch is a kind of a platform that I talk about pretty often in my classes, because how much art games sort of crosses over into like streaming competitive games is often a topic of conversation, but Twitch is a video game specific platform and often not considered a contemporary art cultural space, right? But it started that way where people would stream Call of Duty or Fortnite or what have you, and then it sort of like moved on to being like I'm going to play my guitar for someone on Twitch, and then it was just like we're just going to chat with each other on Twitch, and now everyone is sort of like obliged to cram into the same space that was like originally video game born, you know.
Right. So how does that maybe change the dynamic of Twitch, right? Like how does that then govern how people enter that space?
Right. It was already changing quite a bit, but now it's like really changing. And it was interesting that like it was a platform that I was already familiar with and sort of felt like I had a sort of traditional connection to. And I was talking to painters, performance artists, filmmakers who had never heard of the platform before, and yet all of a sudden the way we were trying to recuperate our losses, so to speak, from canceled events was like through this video game specific medium. So that made me really reflect on, I don't think that the Twitch talk show it's of course a response to do something. So we're still together and we're still talking about our ideas, and that's very positive. But of course it's like no one would actually think that was somehow equivalent to what we were supposed to have done, right, with our original plans, right? We still could acknowledge that like this sucks, right? There's loss involved with all the chaos and restructuring. So I don't want to sort of say this as like a redemptive like commercial for Twitch, but there was something really great about how it's like, well, video games are often, believe it or not, still not considered a part of like a fine art space for many other members of the art world, and all of a sudden it's like we're all on the same front lawn together. Like it all came crashing down,
Right. So and that's got to be so interesting for you, especially because you then are most familiar with the ways that the program can be useful.
Yeah.
Right. So now you become the aficionado.
I would say, of course, I'm aware of Twitch and studied it and talked about it in class. I'm not like a pro streamer myself or anything. But it was just interesting. It's like we're all going to have to like learn a lot more about each other's disciplines, because now we are in this totally new media ecosystem, and it really could last a very long time, maybe forever, if like if a bunch of changes are made so that we can do interesting and creative projects in like a giant Twitch style soup, then maybe some interesting new media formats come out of that, and people just keep doing them, even if they have the options to go back to physical, corporeal, spaces, which of course I want to do eventually. I like doing physical exhibitions, but although like it's still, I think, a struggle and it's overall kind of terrible, that is one interesting, and I guess, dare I say, positive thing, that we're all together in this new space.
Right. We couldn't have had outside painting if we didn't come up with a painting tube, right? It's there's something there.
Yeah.
That's really special.
Yeah.
So then you've spoken about how you now teach, you have taught Twitch in the past in your courses. You're frozen. There we go. And you've listed all of the courses that you teach, which all sound fascinating. But what about this digital environment, maybe, do you think you're going to end up bringing back into the classroom once we hopefully end up back in normal classes?
This one, I'll be honest, I'm having a harder time finding the silver lining on. I really think that a lot of the really special stuff that happens in a classroom that has to do with mentorship and like really like the transference of ideas that further a discipline are based first off of human relationships and a certain amount of trust in those relationships. And if you add a layer of mediation for those relationships just aren't as strong. I guess I do kind of find that to be the case. So I think it is a compromise overall, online or distance learning. That said, I am really impressed with a certain amount of resilience, especially with students that I'm working with this quarter, to be able to do what I thought was planned, all the basic beats and lessons from, so like say like my video games production course, and I tried to recompile it into this online system that was going to be done over Zoom and Canvas. And I thought that, another thing that of course would happen in a production class is that I can actually sit down next to someone and their computer, and we can go over just simple pedestrian stuff like errors,
Right.
And I love those screen shares. It's the amount of work that I can do in that fashion, where I'm sort of like, doing like one-on-one troubleshooting, it's scaled down very quickly with how like much more effort or attention it takes to like do screen share style debugging. So I was kind of expecting it to not be that good, right?
Sure.
And I think there was an attitude across the academy, at least in North America and probably elsewhere. It's just like, we all have to make these massive changes in such a very small amount of time. Let's make sure we don't also like make it even worse for ourselves by demanding that we somehow create a whole new like rocket ship in the process, like
Right.
it's going to be a compromise. So, and that was also like advice like from my administration, right? It's like, this is going to be a challenging quarter, so let's all be patient with each other. I was like, that makes sense. And through all that, maybe because we opened up the space for patience, for things to go wrong, which of course things should go wrong to some extent in any class, right? Like errors are fun and they tell you like new ideas when you work through them creatively. Because we had like an extra amount of space right there, perhaps that has made some pretty interesting projects that I thought that the students, I knew that didn't happen without students individually kind of doubling down, buckling down, doubling down. I don't know which is the right idiom here, but really putting together the technical stuff that's more of a struggle to do over Zoom, and then infusing with their own concepts, and some pretty interesting stuff came through it. Hey, it's okay. That's Maureen and Espen.
Hi.
That's a little Easter egg for you. So I guess that I really admire and appreciate the collective effort, I think, that is going into it, despite the fact that it really is a compromise. And I think that in a way, I think we want to find comfort and strength in finding the positive, but it's like, in a way, kind of important to remember we're losing quite a bit through this process, so that we can store that knowledge and make sure that as soon as we are able to build it back again later.
Right. And I think so much of what I'm seeing is the people around me recognizing how much they actually love school.
It's so much fun.
It's
honestly.
So much fun. And granted, I mean, it is college, so there's a lot of things to love. But even the interaction between professor and students in a seminar-esque classroom, right? There's really nothing else like it. And so my hope is, when we get to go back, that there's a sense of almost reverence, I guess, for being in a space again.
Yeah, and for everyone included, students and faculty and staff, are like, actually, this is an incredibly special thing. And it hasn't been so entirely taken away from us in decades and decades. So that could be a real refresher in just how incredible it is that we have these spaces, which aren't just one building, but like multi-building complexes, where the production of knowledge is actually still like the top priority, right? Like the production of new ideas, like in a place where a lot of parties and a lot of perspectives do not agree with that perspective. That like, really, we have these places where we're just supposed to have very strange, very productively crazy spaces in order to push through margins of sort of what we accept as the everyday and the quotidian, and create new parts of our minds and the world that we can be in. And it takes time and space, and from the outside, it does not necessarily look like super productive, especially from some certain other kinds of industrial perspectives, shall we say. To put a button on that. So anyway, the fact that we do still have them, and that they work, there's still also, of course, all kinds of problems that can come up in a university system, but like, it's still, I do believe that like the job is getting done. So I think that your point is right, that like once we see that like, oh, we kind of need to be in those buildings for this like very critical sort of collective idea generation exercise that we are still doing, like we want to get back in there and like really enjoy it when we do.
I think so. And I'm excited for that time.
Yeah.
So outside of teaching, right, outside of the classroom, the projects that you sometimes, as you explained, get the time to work on, how have those been changing, and what have you been currently working on that you're seeing kind of become altered during this time?
One huge change is the very nature of the work that myself and my colleagues are doing for VGA Gallery. So we as an organization, we started in 2013, just trying to plan our first exhibition. First exhibition was in 2014, and for a few years, we're a traveling organization that we're doing video game related events in other cultural venues that are friendly to our cause. And that was when it was co-founded by myself and Jonathan Kinkley, who works for the Art Institute in Chicago. And that was how the thing started. Then because of a brilliant amount of tenacity and also fundraising, especially on Jonathan's part, he deserves 100% credit for this. We eventually moved into our own brick and mortar space in Chicago, and we were there from 2017 until now. And then we knew from the beginning of this year, around January, that our lease was going to be up and we were going to have to find a new space at the end of this May.
Oh, good.
Crazy timing, right?
That's so great, right?
So we started like mid-January. We're like, okay, 3 years is pretty good for like a sort of sweetheart deal for a not-for-profit art organization. We knew we were going to have to find a new space. Didn't know when it was going to happen, precisely how much money it would cost, and so forth. So I was like, should we take like a brief moment to like do online programming that has less overhead, and then like find another space later? Should we get a space right away? And we were all kind of very confused, and then a very clarifying moment came, right, where there was absolutely no reason to have in-person exhibitions where people are supposed to put their hands on the same Xbox controllers and keyboards and mice. Right. There was just no reason to do it. It's just like not a safe idea to play video games together in public venues.
How wacky, right? Of all things to sort of make the decision for you.
Right. So we clarified it. It was like, okay, actually, we now know very much what the next move is that we are going to just move out of the space and for the time being, become an all online arts organization. And so much of the medium itself is digital, and so much of our practices are digital. So that I do think that it's not really that difficult to transitions. I mean, relatively speaking, we do love having the physical space, and there's all kinds of context and ideas sink in a different way if we're together sharing space. Sure. That said, we do know how to communicate interesting ideas about experimental video games online. So we're going to do that, right? So that's all basically the end of May. Yeah, that we'll officially no longer be in the space. And so what we're focusing on is starting a new publication that will have a number of different kinds of creative responses to talking about video games sort of in the COVID area, called VGA Zine, like an online zine, which is in addition to another publication that's already running called the VGA Reader, which is a peer-reviewed journal on video game art criticism. So both of those are like our writerly projects that already fit pretty neatly into an online context. And we also have this approach towards taking our whole history of exhibitions that were in person, and of course, in-person exhibitions have to come to an end at some point. So we're going to try to take all of those themes and all the games and all the artists and all the artwork that were in those shows and give them a new sort of second digital life. Because although some people saw those in person. Yeah, some people saw those in person, but so many people did not. So it's kind of like we're trying to take this moment. It makes a lot of sense to us to take just the works that has already been done but hasn't been seen by a larger audience, and make sure that there is some sort of version, a new digital twin of that exhibition that will go out there. And this will take the form of itch.io playlists. I don't know if you know this platform, but it's very popular for art games and sort of independently produced games. It's kind of like Bandcamp, but for video games.
Okay.
Like here, so a lot of the games that we show end up being on itch.io anyway, so we can like turn these into these playlists and then sort of juxtapose that with documentation from the show.
Oh, how
writing,
fun. Right. So you're
images.
making a digital exhibition it's
something we wanted to do anyway, right? Because it's just like a good archival practice. But now it's like, well, we really need online exhibitions, and we have a bunch of physical exhibitions about digital art in the past. So like, let's now make them entirely digital so they could exist in the future, and also like be a way to support the artists that we've already been supporting in the COVID moment, right?
Right. Well, exist in the future. That's a really interesting term.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you think that the work that we're creating now, these movements to online, is going to exist in the future in this new, really hybrid way?
Really depends on the rigor of our archival practices.
Sure.
You know, and going back to that, like, what are the sort of empty promises that emerging technology has made to us? Is one of those, like, if you just put it on the internet, it lasts forever. Yeah, and to an extent that is true. There's of course, like, there's bots that Google is scrubbing websites and storing everything, but also a lot does disappear. There's link rot is a real problem, especially with the preservation of media art. So like, I think it takes a sort of considered effort to make sure that we own our own data when it comes to our work, that it's not being, we're not entirely dependent on sort of gigantic third parties, such as your Googles and so forth, to own that forever, that you find a way that you can keep on renewing that and make sure it's there on your own, maybe perhaps your own web hosting, and how strong our other sort of institutional structures are to store these things in larger databases, like the Arts Initiative, right? Like, how long our universities can store these things, because they do tend to either get lost or disappear, or just can't be found if there isn't some amount of grooming, which is all work, right? Like, archivism doesn't just happen on its own. It's something we need to value, put time and effort, and yes, money into, if the answer to your question is a full yes. Right.
Oh, how interesting. Right. So it's trying to figure out maybe what those institutions are, or what those departments are that you trust to sort of archive your ideas.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to move into the next question, because I think that we're moving into it anyway, right? Which is we're archiving, creating. These projects are moving in a really organic way, sort of onto new platforms. So all of these things sound really incredible to me, but what is making you hopeful? What are you seeing around you?
I'll admit, on a personal note, what's most making me hopeful came through the door a second ago. His name is Espen.
That's very real, right?
Yeah, he's 10 months old.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Also, of course, my amazing and brilliant partner, Maureen, also makes me very helpful, but we're both, like, obviously very focused and putting a lot of time and attention into this guy who's very young. He is paradoxically the thing making quarantine most difficult.
Yes.
As far as time management,
right.
But then also making quarantine, or the emotional sting of quarantine, which is, I think, is strong for all of us, entirely bearable.
Right.
Because there's all kinds of futures still, and that can be that would be one way to describe your reaction when looking at an infant.
What is his name?
Espen. It's
Espen.
E-S-P-E-N.
Cool.
And he and
very cool name.
I think I mean this sincerely, that anyone, for ages 0 to like 24 right now, I think is what gives me 100% hope. you know, because I think this is a bad situation, right? Like, well, like it's really great that we are searching for positive things to take hold of, to set goals, to find comfort because we need it, or else we can't move forward. But it's a tragedy around us. It is a crisis around us, and we're going to be dealing with it for a very, very long time. So, and one way we need to do that is to let's say just call out abuse and corruption wherever we see it. And my estimation is anyone I've met that's anywhere between the ages, like I said, of 0 and like 24, when we see, there's so many examples of the rules that wealth inequity have been built on as like something we have to deal with. They've been so exposed as artificial in the process, and I just think that especially people of that generation are when faced with like the fact that they have to sort of accept like deep inequity that exacerbates a situation like this. I don't know. I don't know why anyone would put up with it anymore. You know.
Right. I don't know. Right. I don't know if I accept. I hope I don't accept deep inequities. I feel like that's not the way to go through life at this point, right?
Right. Of course, there are power structures that say we have to, even if we don't like them.
Right.
And I think that the sort of displeasure and maybe even anger at those rationales is going to be so strong that we'll actually take them down. Right. If I can speak in very general language. So yeah, but in general,
please, right.
I see a foment of saying that this, like, of course, there's one biological thing that's really terrible, and then also, broadly speaking, we have people who are already in positions of power and privilege who have used this to make themselves more powerful and more privileged, and others are having a very difficult time, which is an understatement. Say, if you're losing your life, you're not just having a difficult time, right?
Right.
And I think this is going to just be such like a clarifying example of why structural change is like the only thing to do, maybe over the next few decades.
I'm not going to make that statement, right?
I'm not going to make any decisions for people who are currently between the ages of 0 and 24, right? Everyone's going to do it on their own. I just estimate that people are like, this is obviously full of scams and broken logics that no longer work, and we're going to change them. That's what gives me hope. That's
wonderful. And I agree wholeheartedly and hope that you're right.
Yeah, me too. I could be wrong, but that's why we're talking about hope.
There we go. Right. Yeah. Utopias, please.
Yeah.
So we're asking everyone this question. And I think it's something that's really important to hear right now, because we have so many students who are looking at the future a little bit scared, because we are on hold.
Right.
Maybe video games have this really unique niche that allows them to continue, but even the work that's done to put them together cannot be functioning in the same ways. So putting yourself at the precipice of graduation, yeah, and thinking back to that time, yeah, do you have any advice or words of wisdom that you would give yourself then that you think you've learned now?
Yeah, and I would like to answer it in a sort of medium specific way. Of course, like, because this is my interest is, I often will talk about what I sort of really am interested in supporting is a video game avant-garde, or what's really a constellation of many video game avant-gardes. To say an emerging discipline that is unresolved, and that there are all kinds of positions that can still be taken, and honestly, no actual barrier to entry. If you feel as if there is a barrier to entry into this field, it is actually a mirage, probably put there by someone else to make you think that there is a barrier when there's not. So that, let me put that in other words. What would sort of my advice be to myself or to a sort of current graduate? If you are interested in the least bit in dealing with interactive media, video games, and so forth, I do think this is a particularly good time to get involved into this conversation. because so many conventions are being rethought, and whoever is just working on the subject right now actually gets a very substantive say on sort of what that thing is. And that's just kind of the nature of like a historical cycle. If you are dealing with performance art in the 1960s and 70s, like whatever you just happen to do casts a really long shadow in the history of performance art, right? And I think whatever is happening right now in video game art, even if it feels very everyday and very quotidian, it feels like it's just whatever you're doing in this moment. We're currently making all of those sort of like canonical columns that are going that are and are going to determine what this incredibly powerful and variable, strange, and constantly changing medium is going to do socially and culturally. So, and the other thing about, this sounds like I'm like a used car salesman for video games. I don't need to sell people on video games, right? They're already a part of so many people's lives. Especially as in my experience, people who are currently in an undergraduate or graduate program of study, like they've already spent a life with video games as incredibly important cultural texts that have informed the way they think about the world, and the way ideas just are shared, right? Like this is the media that has just been a partner for all of those levels of cognition. So I don't really think I need to make the pitch, but so I imagine that there are a lot of people right now who are interested in games. Maybe they feel like they are only consumers of games. They have a lot of maybe complaints about the general ideologies or proposals that come out of mainstream games. And then they feel like there's no way for you to do anything about that except maybe shout about it on Twitter or to your friends. In fact, video game production is, it's difficult, it's time consuming. So in many cases, there's no, just like any other creative medium, there's no like guaranteed monetary result. But there is no barrier, right? And especially when people think you have to like be a computer scientist or a programmer, these are myths. It is not true. Video games incorporate all these different disciplines and all these different thought styles and all these learning styles. So that's one of the other interesting myths that sort of keeps the pool of people involved with the discipline more homogenous than it needs to be. So like discard that idea, but also programming is really interesting. And even if you're a humanist, you can probably do it too. That's another thing I'd say, this sort of disciplinary way of giving advice to graduates. And like I said earlier, with the theme of like video games were sort of, natively digital. And that's why it was sort of interesting for me to be a part of that talk show with people who are not natively digital all of a sudden in sort of like my yard. Like you don't have to make the same kind of artistic compromises if, say, in a terrible scenario, if there's more situations like this where like the outdoors just like aren't biologically safe, and as long as we still have bandwidth, like video games work in this way, where in other media, I'm talking to filmmakers and painters and so forth, and they're sort of like, what do we do? It's not the same. And really, like video games are the same in this space. They were screen based, and they were domestic all along. So that's not so much like I don't know if you're looking for like some sort of
be strong, be yourself, right?
Like that was like very practical.
No, but practicality is key, especially right now. It's unbelievably useful.
Yeah, so I think for practical reasons, it's a very interesting field to be in, but also just as far as the history of emerging media, this, in my view, is the avant-garde that has the ability to speak to the current cultural context the most, right? These ideas are not necessarily my own. They're definitely ones I subscribe to, but it's like very well articulated by a scholar named Brian Schrank, who positions experimental video games as they're techno-cultural objects, and that therefore they're the best things that can intervene upon the ideas that are delivered to us through technoculture. And what is like quarantine living other than technoculture, right? The way we talk to each other has to be through media and through computers in one way or another. And it's going to be harder to comment on that or rework those ideas or intervene upon them through a painting than it would be with something that also runs on computers.
That's a really interesting logic jump.
I hope so. Yeah, so that Trank calls that playing with technoculture. And that's a philosophy that I believe I do subscribe to. And therefore, if there's something about talking with each other in the quarantine area that we want to do through creative media, that's not necessarily just like talking on video calls or writing essays, the video game very much could be the thing, right? That could be leveraged the most.
So, so I want to ask you, and this is not in my questions, but have you heard of Detroit Become Human, the video game?
Sure, I've not played it, but
okay.
I know of its response to an extent.
Okay, so I just think of it because it feels very much like one of these games that comments on morality without commenting on morality.
Yeah.
In a really interesting way. And so it leads me down this path of thought, which sort of becomes convoluted because I haven't thought it through enough yet. But to think about the ways that technoculture can be intervened by itself, right? What innovation needs to take place to allow you to sneak into the world that's already been created by people like you? Yeah.
Well, I think software literacy is sort of what comes to mind, right? Like the rhetoric, the creative rhetoric that we can use is software, because the technoculture that we are receiving is software made by people in positions of power and influence. So if we're trying to use a different language outside of that language to speak back to it, it will probably get caught up into a larger, more powerful system. So yeah, it's sort of, yeah, right. Language is, I think, a good way to think about it. And if we can't speak in the same language of the sort of current structures of power, it's going to be very difficult to create any alterations, interventions, changes to them.
Right, and putting people on the same platforms might lead to slightly easier translations.
Yeah. So that's why I think it's very important that software literacy is not simply a matter of left to computer scientists, right?
Right. Like, can you code? That's not it, right? It's
that's one part of it, and it's great. And honestly, it's probably more accessible than a lot of code phobes might think. It's something I think to spread around more, but it also is a larger conversation than just programming.
Right, and that's really incredible, and I think hopeful. Yeah. To use the word again, right? Yeah. It's yeah. All right. Well, I want to say, Chaz, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today about your work. It is amazing to hear how you've been teaching, adapting, and creating your own digital projects in the face of the world turning upside down.
Sure.
So for Hello Precarity, COVID FML edition, I'm Madeline Greenburg. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to not meet again in this context.
Yes, hopefully meet again in person someday.
Yes, so I'll stop recording now.
All right, thanks.